Thank you so much, Hannah. Today we have Assistant Professor Yolande Bouka presenting on gender, politics, and security. Professor Bouka is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. Her research and teaching focus on gender, African politics and security, political violence, and field research ethics in conflict-affected societies. Her current research is a multi-sided historical and political analysis of female combatants in Southern Africa, and her previous research, In the Shadow of Prison, Power, Identity, and Transactional Justice in Post-Genocide Rwanda, focused on the social and political impacts of the power-laden nature of the Rwandan Transitional Justice Program. Professor Bouka has received support from the Fulbright Scholar Program and the American Association of University Women. Prior to her time at Queen's University, she was a visiting assistant professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Denver. In addition to her academic work, she has worked with and offered support to USAID, the UK Department for International Development, the United Nations, the African Union, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the United States Institute of Peace. And currently she serves on the Research Advisory Council of the Resolve Network, a global consortium of researchers and practitioners committed to empirical research on the drivers of violent extremism and sources of community resilience. So we are very excited to have her join us today. So Professor Bouka will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have the remaining half hour for questions from our audience. As always, please hold your questions until the end. And for those on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A function, and Elizabeth will read them off to the room. For those of you in the room, feel free to raise your hand and we will gladly provide you with a mic. As always, we ask that the questions be framed as a question, short and on point, and relevant to our speaker's topic. So with that, we welcome Professor Yolande Bouka to the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this working correctly? All right. It's an absolute pleasure to be among you today. I want to give a special thanks to the Harvard Women in Public Policy Program for the invitation to present about my collaborative project to this research seminar. When I was asked to present today, I was a bit unsure about whether the project was going to be a good fit for this series for a couple of reasons. The first one is that this is very much a work in progress. Actually, one of my collaborators is currently in Eastern Europe conducting interviews with one of our postdocs. I am going next week back to West Africa to conduct interviews with some of the members of the communities with which I've been engaging over the past year. So yeah, so very much a work in progress, and we're very much still in the process of identifying some of our main findings. But also, while mediation is part of the activity that my team is researching, it's not necessarily the dominant topic of, or the lens that we use specifically in terms of understanding what the women are doing in our particular research. With that being said, I think, and I'm hoping that the presentation will open an investigative window for you to understand how the communities of practice in which women work, but also the institutional context in which they're conducting their day-to-day work definitely impacts how they develop norms and how they develop their priorities with regards to the women, peace, and security agenda. This project is a 5-year project financed by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada. And I have the pleasure to working on this initiative with 2 of my colleagues at Queen's University in the Department of Political Studies, and I will present them a little bit later in my presentation. So I should probably take the clicker. And so it is a comparative study of the WPS agenda, and I'll come to this particular context in a second. And we are looking at how WPS, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, is implemented across 3 regional organizations. Before I dive into the topic, I think it's important to discuss the academic and policy conversation and context in which our questions emerge and the research project itself was designed. We will soon be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the WPS agenda, or at least the UN Security Council 1325, which kind of established, and I'm sure given that this is one of the last presentation of your series, you've heard and talked about, when we talk about the pillars of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, we're really discussing issues of prevention, participation, protection, and relief and recovery. So we're 23 years in, pretty soon it'll be 25 years, a quarter of a century, as I like to call it, to kind of put an impact on the fact that this is pretty much an accepting set of norms that at least, with which there's at least an expectation that regional organizations and countries are willing, able to adopt and have provided resource to be able to assess the progress over the past 25 years. The agenda is a series of resolutions that emphasize other aspects of the agenda has a series of resolutions that emphasize other aspects of the agenda, such as the use of sexual violence in warfare, and how to operationalize and measure WPS as a tool and whether or not there's been any types of impact. But there's also in some of the resolution conversations about the role that men and boys play in the promotion of WPS. So as you see, in addition to discussing the prevention and protection, there's also a resolution that really tried to get at how do you actually operationalize an objective, something that is aspirational, but is actually crucial in order to sustaining peace and security. The agenda, of course, in order to be supported, has or comes with an obligation to develop a national action plan in order to see how each country will implement the agenda. Kirby and Shepard, two brilliant scholars, have done a lot of work to study and analyze the norms and the practices that are linked to the development of national action plans globally. And one of the last studies that they worked on was really, particularly Professor Shepard, was really on mapping, first of all, who had a national action plan, what kind of thematic emerged in terms of how countries set their priorities. And along with this research and some of the insightful findings that were found was that countries in the global north, as you probably have heard, have a tendency to develop national action plans that are geared towards the international community. How are they going to support countries in the global south or post-conflict countries or conflict-affected countries in achieving their gender and equality goals? On the other hand, countries from the global south, it's been at least identified, often develop national action plans that really focus on what they must do themselves in order to achieve their goals with regards to gender equality, and how to implement the type of, develop and implement and support the type of policies that will provide peace and security at home. So one of the main idea here to keep in mind is that global North countries, European and North American countries, often look at national action plans as foreign policy tools, as opposed to mechanisms through which they rethink how they can achieve gender equality at home. The other context in which our research emerged, or at least the other aspect that we kept in mind as we developed our research, is really the diversity of geopolitical context in which each country is operating, and the type of security challenges that they each face. So if we're talking about the African continent, as we're very much aware, there are the past decade an evolution of how security challenges have emerged. What we first thought about civil wars have evolved in more of challenges with regards to radicalization and terrorism activities, but you also see an increase of popular protests who themselves are sometimes peaceful, but also sometimes turn violent. If we think about North America, we have not yet seen the type of conflict we see in other places like in Africa. However, there is an increase in radicalization of youth as well towards the rise of white supremacy and white nationalism as well. So the levels of and the types of insecurity and geopolitical context definitely impact the ways in which institutions will think about implementing their security policies, but as well impact how women and how we think about the gender dynamics of security in these particular, evolve in these particular regions. I think it's important to note as well that not all regional organizations are made equal. And I'll show you in a minute which regional organizations we're trying to study. But some of them, like the European Union, are organizations that are highly legislative, that require quite a bit of consensus among its members. And once those resolutions or the laws are passed, kind of hold all the countries accountable. They're legally bound to apply the types of rules that have been developed. On the other hand, the African Union is constituted of 55 countries, and the types of resolutions that are passed, depending on which institutions within the union, depending on where they're developed, may not be binding. Right? So you have different institutions that develop guidelines, that develop declarations and policies, and so on and so forth. But country X is not necessarily bound by those policies in order to be in good standings within the organization. Hence, when we look at the African Union, what we see is often quite a number of different protocols and documentations really towards aspirational goals towards women, peace, and security, but quite a bit of challenges in terms of ensuring that all the members actually have implemented these particular sets of policies and priorities. Unfortunately, as we've been doing this research, we've also noticed a certain degree of stagnation or backlash or WPS fatigue. It's been almost 25 years. We keep talking about the importance of including women in various types of institutions. The institutions themselves may have diversified, but they have not necessarily changed themselves. Now, of course, in the scholarship on women, on gender and international relations, there's a lot of questions about whose responsibility it is to change security institutions, right? There's also conversations about whether women in politics yield the type of transformation that is expected of them, and whether descriptive representation is sufficient in order to have substantive representation. So there's a little bit of a lull in terms of knowing what to do. I think a lot of people are on the same page, even if they're a bit reluctant about the need, at least for human rights purposes and equality purposes, to include women in all aspects of political life and security. But what do you do beyond that, right? There were also conversations about gender mainstreaming, to remove language that is gender neutral, that does not take into consideration the specific needs of women, but these are policies on papers, and the extent to which, for example, military institutions go beyond changing what's on paper and change the actual culture of their institution remains quite unclear. And there is currently globally, and there's great research that is coming out on this, the reality of backlash. And this backlash, or this conceptual term, really looks at how people or groups of people who have power respond when they feel like they're losing some of their powers due to equality-seeking norms, practices, and rules. And it's the resistance to those changes that we call backlash. And sometimes the clawing back of power looks like the erosion of gains achieved through equity-seeking practices or rules, or simply discourses that discourage the inclusion and the inclusion of underrepresented groups, or diversity of some institution. And that is very visible in terms of what's happening here in the United States with regards to the loss of some of the reproductive rights that women have, but also conversations that then kind of spill over into other countries. And particularly in a context where countries who were perceived to be champions of gender equality lose their interest, or there's less resources available domestically, it often means that they also have less resources available to assist other partners around the world who were dependent on them to advance the cause of gender equality. And finally, which is very much linked to the first, this idea of WS fatigue. As I am somebody who at the moment also has the opportunity to be a co-director of a Canadian research network on women, peace, and security, and I engage with a variety of scholars, activists, and security actors and security sector stakeholders, and they confirm, they want to know, okay, what now? What do we do now? We're tired of hearing about women, peace, and security. We have hard and real security concerns. That already tells you, in terms of the type of language that they're using, that women, peace, and security, at least in the head of some of those stakeholders, was never a priority to begin with. Yeah. And with the rise of nationalism and patriarchal backlash, people are starting to think we need to move on to something else. So this is the context in which our research questions emerge, because we often have the assumption that WPS is understood similarly across the world or across actors, and the implementation differences are based on different distributions of resources, or differences in cultures or priorities. And we were really curious about the process of meaning making and consensus building with regards to the WPS agenda across different regions. So how do regional organizations integrate WPS norms in their practices? Not just what they write, but in actually what they do on a regular basis. So some of the questions that are linked to that overarching umbrella question is, what are the mechanisms through which WPS considerations are integrated into regional organizations' day-to-day practices? Yeah. The second question is, what are the regional differences in the articulation and implementation of the agenda? So even in terms of how you articulate the priorities, how do you articulate the meaning of the agenda itself, and how then do you implement said agenda, varies from one region to another. And what are implementation challenges and contested meanings embodied by the WS agenda across regional contexts? So this particular project required this wonderful team of scholars, and I'm going to pause a little bit about the importance of collaboration. As an academic, I definitely enjoy being able to working at my own pace. I enjoy asking my questions in my own head and trying to engage with different types of stakeholders, only to be able to come back to my office and then sort through the analysis on my own and kind of figure out the questions myself. But when I arrived at Queen's in 2019, I found a wonderful community of scholars who were working on different things than I was. My particular strength is in security and WPS, but really within the context of African peace and security. Stephanie Von Lackey, who is a Canada Research Chair on gender and the Canadian Armed Forces, really her strength is NATO. And I never thought that I'd be working on somebody who works on NATO, because I just think those organizations are completely different. I'm also an anti-empire type of thinker, decolonial, so I had a little bit of antipathy towards that research. But as we exchange and really learn to work together, I also learned to understand the benefits of bringing in my toolkit different types of methodologies. Even the type of questions that I was asking were quite different from Professor Von Lackey or Professor Martel, whose regional expertise is in East Asia. And I can tell you that this project has been ongoing now for 18 months, and it's been an absolute treat to get to work with people who work on very different regions, but also with different sets of expertise. Dr. Martel is an absolute star when it comes to understanding IO literature. I am third rate when it comes to that scholarship, and bringing those strengths together and really leveraging each other's strength in the slow development of our proposal really made and continues to make our research project quite interesting and stimulating, even as we're engaging in field research in our respective spaces, but also with our students. And I think our students benefit from that. I'd like to add that we have a team of doctoral students, master's students, and undergraduate students with whom we engage and that we take on field research. And this is always interesting to talk about the findings, but I also think it's important to think about how you articulate the questions and how you work on the development of the project itself. So I'm not sure how many times you're gonna have somebody talk about the joys of collaboration, but I just wanted to highlight this here about how important it is. So we are comparing NATO, ASEAN, and the African Union. They are very, very, very different. The role they play is actually different. ASEAN really is really shying away from securitizing all types of issues such as environmental degradation. They have a lot of concerns in their debates. What emerge a lot from their debates is concerns about securitizing issues they believe that should be under really exclusively civilian oversight. And the African Union, a lot of issues are securitized, right? Everything has been framed as a security issue. The environment, technology, gender equality, not only in terms in the political sphere, but also economic gender equality. So, and when we come to NATO, NATO is not a political type of organization. It is strictly military. So we're not talking about state and their representative, but really speaking about military branches of these organizations. So as we were discussing, trying to figure out how we're going to find questions that are relevant for each of our regional organizations, but allows us for comparison, we had to have a little bit of flexibility in order to harmonize methods and workflow in a way that allowed comparison, but still respected this context in which we were going to conduct the research. So the framework that ended up being useful for us is using the framework of communities of practice. So our framework is based on the concept of communities of practice, first coined by Wenger in 1998 and applied to security studies by Adler in 2008 and signed in 2011. The community of practice is a like-minded group of practitioners who are formally as well as contextually bound by a common interest in learning and applying a common practice, right? So I like to think about, and this is something that I've, of course, gotten from online, but I think is a very nice and neat organization of communities and of practice. There's a domain in which they are operating, and they have a shared interest and key issues in which they're focusing on, and through multiple iterations. And I know Alex and I'm sorry, Alex and Elizabeth have heard me use the concept of multiple iterations quite a lot this afternoon, but it's through multiple iterations of interactions that the domain, the frontiers or the boundaries of the domain are established, and through which these communities emerge. And then you're able to kind of tangibly see the body of knowledge, methods, and stories and tools that are developed. I think what we all appreciated about the concept of community of practice is that you are able to identify and map the actors, even if the actors are not always the same. And if the actors change, you're actually able to see where and how these communities emerged, right? So over the series of years or of a period of time, you actually see the type of tools that are developed by those communities, and the set of priorities and norms that emerge from the practice. We are also aware that by virtue of the differences of these organizations, the domain may look different, but we're still talking about what's happening in the field of WPS. The relationship within those communities will also be different. For example, in the organization that I'm in charge of, which is the African Union, I often have the privilege of speaking with women who are leaders of particular organizations, and the leadership does not vary very often. Right? It's often the same women. I'm also often pointed, if I visit one country, pointed to the same women that have been in that space for quite some time. On the other hand, Professor Von Lackey, who works primarily with militaries within NATO countries, will often see gender desk officers being changed and rotated because they've been assigned to different spaces. So even how robust these communities, like the robustness of these communities of practice, will vary based on the institution and the site that we're observing. And even the practice themselves, we've been also working a lot in the past 3 or 4 months in comparing the types of stories the members of the communities of practice tell themselves about who they are, about their priorities, about themselves, about what WPS is, and what should be their role within these institutions. So then let's focus specifically on on the space that I'm currently researching. The African Union has 50, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the African Union is composed or has 55 countries as members. That's a lot of countries to try to build consensus around, or at least have similar definitions about what should be prioritized. Professor Chieku, who's based in Ontario in Canada, has done a substantive amount of research on the African Union as an institution. And what we find is that there's a lot of informality in how the institution operates. A lot of things happen on the sides of meetings, on the sides of actual the actual physical building of the African Union in Addis Ababa. And that each institutions or each office within the African Union, and there are many of them, also develop their own types of practices and expectations about how the way the offices are run. Hiring practices as well are quite informal, which means that they are often kind of competition, but which members of your country is going to fill different types of position, right? So with this particular type of particularity about this regional organization, what you're going to find, and this is a poor attempt at looking at, for example, the Peace and Security Council at the African Union, what are the different types of systems and commissions and funds and institutions and panels that all influence how the Peace and Security Council operates. So you have the African Standby Forces, which has, even though it's been discussed and pushed to come into being for the past 15 years or so, it's only in the past few years that you've seen different regional organizations have the capacity to develop relatively at-ready forces to be deployed in case of emergency, right? And not all the regional organizations have them, but it's one that still must be in conversation when a mission has to be developed or at least open in a particular country. The Panel of the Wise is a selection of, as you probably understand it, of senior African leaders who are often consulted in order to identify the approach to some of the security challenges that emerge in the sub-region. And of course, the Continental Early Warning System is a bunch of very brilliant bureaucrats who spend most of their time identifying and sending to the Peace and Security Council memos and communiques about what is happening in the region. As you see, this is only the Peace and Security Council. Like, if I were to show you a full map of the organization of the African Union, you would see multiple layers of organizations that operate in that space. And I can list you a couple that are related simply to the Women in Peace and Security agenda. Those include the Directorate of Women, Gender and Youth, FemWise, which is an NGO that has been attached to the African Union and engages in the training of women who are going to be mediators, the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Office, the Office of the Special Envoy of Women, Peace and Security, and the African peace and security architecture as a whole. And I've 5, and there's many more to that, right? And each of these is take it upon itself to develop what they believe to be some sort of map, guide map on how to implement the women, peace, and security agenda within their own offices. But the African Union itself also has, in terms of document, about 24, about 20 of them, different documents that constitute the legal framework under which the WPS implementation is taking place. So one, you have, of course, the African Union Constitutive Act of 2000, the Maputo Plan of Action, which is kind of a regional, continental action plan for gender equality. You have the AU Gender Policy of 2009, the revised plan of action in 2016, the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Strategy that then came later. Yeah. So all of these constitute documents that somehow create some sort of framework. One thing that becomes very apparent as you're researching these documents is that there's a lot of them. There's a lot of institutions that work with them, but it's very difficult to measure how they're implemented. Some scholars argue that, while the African Union is often lauded as being one of the most advanced institutions in terms of developing policies for women, peace and security, and the women, peace and security agenda, a lot of these instruments, because they're difficult to measure, are mostly aspirational than actually something that is going to yield specific types of results. Aspiration has value, but the extent to which you can measure how well these policies are developed makes it quite challenging to really assess whether it's useful or not. So I've talked about the multiple instruments, and I've listed a few scholars who've done this work over the past 10 years, wonderful scholars who really kind of dissect these instruments and really tell you where exactly within the entire African Union peace and security architecture specific arguments have more weight. And I've also explained what I have not gotten to yet, which I will in the next few minutes, is talk about the regional organizations. The African Union is the institution we understand has the general oversight or the general jurisdiction over peace and security on the African continent. That being said, it is supported and it works in tandem with regional organizations in various parts of the continent. Some of these regional organizations include the East African Community that includes countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda. And you also have ECOWAS, which is the region that I will finish with, which is the Economic Community of West African States. You also have the ICGLR that focuses specifically in the Great Lakes region of Africa, and SADC, which is mostly in Southern Africa, and IGAD, that's like on the eastern coast of Africa. What you notice is that many countries have overlapping memberships in those regional organizations, and that not all of these the regional organizations have the same level of first resources, but also a level of power. Countries are fully aware of the trickiness of being a member of multiple organizations. And when they want to protect themselves from the rules of one organization, they often leverage their membership in a secondary organization to kind of let go of some of the obligations they have. It also allows them to participate, engage, and leverage the resources of multiple parties at the same time. Then so what when it comes to women? Right? When it comes to the various actors in the women, peace, and security agenda. It also means that they have to be savvy and understand that their states, particularly women, civil society organizations that are nationally situated, where their countries are members to multiple organizations at the same time, they have to be nimble about the space in which they decide to engage and determine which organization may have the most power, the best context in which to operate, and which one may end up being a waste of time for them. Yeah, so you always want to keep this type of context in mind. And what I've put on top here is the various challenges to peace. Now, my intent here was not to make the list long to say, oh my gosh, Africa is, challenged by so many of these problems, because in reality, increasingly what we're noticing that a lot of these challenges are actually realities wherever you're located in the world. But we're talking about displacement. We can look at the situation of Ukraine, for example, as an example of where displacement is very much a part of everyday conversation. Cybersecurity is one that touches countries all over the world, illicit trade and transnational crime, gender-based violence, whether we like it or not. And as somebody who works and operates in Canada, cannot emphasize enough the ways murdered and missing Indigenous women is a problem that continues to plague Canadian society. So a lot of these challenges, and even electoral violence is something that is, as we know, something that is becoming in many parts of the world that we thought were not going to have this issue a reality. So within all these challenges, the African Security Union works with a variety of regional organizations through the principle of subsidiarity, right? So the idea that the regions have jurisdiction to take the lead on various conflict and security situations with the assistance of the African Union. So what is ECOWAS? ECOWAS is this entire region. And if you're familiar with Southern African states, it's often big countries that we're talking about, yeah, like Zimbabwe and South Africa. Even if you look at at East African countries like Tanzania and Kenya, very large swatches of land. And what you notice in the West African community is actually very much a variety of types of states, some that are landlocked, some of them have access to the ocean, some that are mostly desert, some that are heavily urban. You have very large urban areas. You have formerly francophone colonies or francophone countries that were under francophone French authority during the colonial era, and others that have different types of colonial legacies, including Portuguese and British, right? And despite all these differences, these particular countries have come together as an economic community. Now, they do not all have the same currency. Some are a part of the CFA zone and some are not part of the CFA zone. But it's a space which over the past, I would say, quarter of a century or more, has seen a number of conflicts where where ECOWAS has been very active in providing peacekeepers, peace enforcers in some cases, and where there is an understanding, at least until recently, of the letting go of certain degrees of sovereignty in order for the regional organization to be able to keep a certain degree of stability and peace in the region. Unlike the East African community, who has been known, at least until recently, and things change, as a region that was mostly focused on economic integration. So women and women organizations in that region have had quite a number of opportunities to participate in negotiation because of, for lack of a better word, the reality of many countries having some sort of instability in the past few decades. And they're not the same. Today, we know that Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger have been, as a consequence, partially to the Libya crisis, have been plagued with quite a bit of instability. Yeah. ECOWAS is also one of the few regional organizations that also has a regional action plan. Actually, it has two. It worked on one and then came up with a second iteration of that action plan. It has its own instruments. It has the ECOWAS conflict prevention framework. It has a simplified African Union's continental framework on women, peace, and security. So that region, as I'm speaking to people, and particularly women, when I'm trying to ask them, where are you looking for guidance? What is is the African Union really as relevant as we think in terms of setting the priorities for ECOWAS and the women's groups are working within the ECOWAS region. What I've heard in my research in Senegal and my research in Togo is actually we turn to ECOWAS. Yeah. ECOWAS is our guiding light with the framework that it has. This is where we said that the framework we use to think about the priorities for WPS. So the African Union, which finds itself completely on the other side of the continent, ends up not being as useful or relevant depending on the immediacy of the needs that they have. One of the documents that came out a few years ago was the African Union Continental Framework on Women, Peace, and Security. This came out of the Office of the Special Envoy at the African Union. This was supposed to be a tool to be able to measure the implementation level of the WPS agenda across countries. Countries were to take this very thick document, hire a monitoring and evaluation team, and kind of tick the boxes to figure out where support had been provided in various aspects of the women in peace and security. But it was too thick. It was not as useful as it needed to be. It wasn't user-friendly. So ECOWAS took the leadership as a regional organization to bring in members of civil society from all over the region in order to work multiple times on how to simplify this continental framework. This is now, actually, they met, based on the last information that I received, they met in September, they met again in November, and developed a simplified version of the document, very much based on the ECOWAS conflict prevention framework as a priority setting tool. So as you see, the African Union, which is often understood or imagined to be as a site of direction for peace and security, but also for WPS overall, ends up being relegated to the side, particularly in a context where a lot of activities are already taking place with regards to peace and security. One thing that I'm finding fascinating as I'm starting this research is looking at how organizations that are kind of the ecosystem of organizations that exist within the WPS space in West Africa. ECOWAS is definitely a leader in wanting to invest in bringing these women together. As I was interviewing people in Senegal, one of the interviewees that I spoke with told me, yeah, I just came back from an ECOWAS event and I have to go back for another ECOWAS event that is also focused on the women, peace, and security agenda in a couple of months. Right? And she said, yeah, they bring us together on a regular basis and they meet in different countries to be able to have these conversations. Yeah, so the leadership of the region in this particular case really makes a difference in terms of creating spaces where civil society organizations are able to meet multiple times, follow up on initiatives, and really create and set their priorities with the same people, even if they don't always represent the same organization, or if they're not always present at every event, there's a very high chance that they will find themselves again to continue conversations. Now, of course, these organizations don't only depend on ECOWAS. They also depend on WhatsApp and other means of communications, but also their own initiatives to meet on a regular basis. But seeing how ECOWAS is deliberately bringing those organizations together, which means they're paying for flights, they're paying for lodging as they are working through these multi-day long working sessions, really creates a placeholder where these communities can meet. So WANEP is the West African Network of Peace for Peace Building. It's not a woman-led organization by design, but what you see is quite a number of women who have leadership roles. And technically the WANEP organization, WANEP as an organization, has an office in each of the West African countries that constitute ECOWAS. The same thing is the reality from the organization that is completely on top. It's REPSFECO, the Réseau de Paix et Sécurité pour les Femmes, Espace CEDEAO. So it's the Network for Peace and Security for the Women within ECOWAS. Also has an office in each of the ECOWAS countries. And sometimes individual activists and individual women will have as well overlapping memberships in these organizations. So there's a possibility to exchange knowledge within and between organizations. FAS, Femmes Africaines Solidarité, was an organization, is an organization based in Dakar as well, that was spearheaded by the current special envoy to for women, peace and security at the African Union. This particular organization has been instrumental in helping countries, African countries, in developing their national action plan. Their level of expertise, their connection with the African Union and Addis facilitated conversations with countries in West Africa and elsewhere with NGOs in those countries to start thinking and developing their national action plan. And in fact, FAS had a very large, important in the post-1325 signature in pushing and putting pressure on the development of national action plans. One of the things that I found the most fascinating when I was doing at least the initial conversation with the people in this space is to see the number of women who actually, those who live in Senegal, the number of women who went on to move to WANEP and the Gorée Institute, for example, but started at FAS as a point of departure. Often young graduate students, or young women who had finished their preliminary studies and were looking for an internship and went on 10, 15 years later to work in other organizations. Right? And I'm very curious about what I'm going to find when I go to Togo and when I go to Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire is the headquarters of the REPSECO organization, the Network for Peace and Security for Women within the ECOWAS space. And looking at the genealogies that actually create and initiate those types of organizations and how they manage to work across boundaries linguistically sometimes and culturally in order to achieve their goals. And I'm going to finish with a little bit of an anecdote. If we go back, when Niger had its coup recently, there were a lot of conversations about imposing a very large embargo around the country. As you see, Niger is landlocked country, an embargo would have been, trade embargo would have been quite catastrophic for the population, particularly in terms of where it's located in terms of security and what comes from the north, but also given the climate of the region. And, this story I've heard 3 times. So, social sciences, more than triangulation, I was able to get kind of this story multiple times, is the ways in which, if you do some research on the negotiation of Niger, what you will see is very important men in suit jackets speaking to the coup plotters and speaking to the former, or at least trying to speak with the former president who had just been deposed, about trying to figure out a solution to ensure that Niger did not get suspended from the African Union and things could be normalized. But part of the negotiation, the track to negotiation that took place, were a group of women who knew each other from all these multiple iterations of meetings and met, and particularly had in mind the fact that embargoes were going to hurt the population. Embargo were going to disproportionately, render vulnerable people who were poor and people who did not have access to large, amounts of money or food reserves. So it is on the margins of official conversation that these women met with high-ranking as well, political leaders, but also other NGOs within the region in order to make sure that whatever sanctions were going to be imposed on Niger did not lead to an embargo that would make the population more vulnerable. And the pride with which people talked about this possibility really speaks to not only the experience, but also a very strong confidence in these women's ability to enact change and negotiate with impact in the region. Thank you very much.